So John Riccitilla's shitty comments have me kind of thinking today. He's kind of right. And that feels like a very bold statement to make, but just stay with me on this. Hey, I just wanted to make a quick addendum to this video while I was recording something completely different. But I just wanted to drop it and say that Riccitilla is absolutely not saying the same things I'm saying here. In fact, he's talking about building in and planning in microtransactions as early as possible, ostensibly turning the PC indie landscape into, mobile ad revenue driven based hell. And so I just wanted to drop a little update in there, and that as much as I had fun making this video, I wanted people to know exactly where I stood in this and that I'm not actually saying that Riccitilla is right, because it's just funny Twitter clickbait, really. So I've been thinking about that John Riccitilla quote, and honestly, he's not wrong. And that's frustrating because the way he's saying it is really bad, and the way he means it is probably even worse given the fact that it is Unity. However, I will say this. Indies kind of rely too much on the idea that one day a publishing scout is going to slide into their DMs because they posted a really compelling Twitter GIF. Or the notion that publishing negotiations are going to take place on a reasonable timescale for most people. I don't know about you, but most folks that I know have bills to pay. They have things to take care of. They have families. They have pets. They don't exactly have the kind of cash burn on hand to sit and wait through 12 to 15 months of negotiations. And that's assuming you even get an offer of fair terms. You have to go to trade shows, you have to pitch multiple times, sometimes 20 minutes to an hour to each individual publisher, mostly to have weeks of not hearing anything, and then suddenly either rejections or requests to rework numbers. And I want to talk about reworking numbers for a second, because something that's extremely frustrating about that is that we don't actually have any realistic way of how to quantify how to turn a profit on a game. And when I'm talking about this, I mean the Boxleitner method. And the Boxleitner method is a formula that essentially, from my understanding of it, takes kind of a best guess of what games have publicly displayed their numbers as, the few rare times anyone is willing to share their sales analytics. So based on that, we're able to sort of run this comprehensive value of what it's being sold at, how many copies it shipped, and how many of those copies we think actually sold. In the cases of digital games, that's a pretty easy equation. But back in the day with physical boxes, it was more of a situation where Walmart or GameStop would buy a bunch of copies of your games, and then those might sell later. Whereas now we're doing sort of direct-to-consumer stuff, which is great, but comes with a lot of its own challenges. And that's the thing that's probably important to think about. The numbers are kind of made up. We have some really good guesses, and we think we know what we're talking about, but ultimately nobody does. Not the publishers, not the game developers individually selling them. The only way that you can know how many copies of your game are going to sell is simply by selling the game and seeing what happens. A YouTuber could show up and your game suddenly spikes its lifetime sales. The point being, this doesn't seem very sustainable. And whether you're waiting for a publisher to show up or you're thinking about pitching yourself to a venture capitalist, there's downsides to both. Publishing terms are not always very fair or reasonable, sometimes having you give up access to your IP or first right of refusal or a multitude of other terms that exist throughout the industry. And we're not going to even get into rate of return and percentages and any of that stuff. I'm not a business analyst and I'm not a lawyer. I just know that some of these deals are a bit of a raw time. And that's really kind of the issue here, right? What does the future even look like? As soon as venture capital money starts to dry up, that affects both publishers and independent people invest in you. So that leaves angel investment and direct-to-customer sales and being able to monetize your pipeline, which is kind of what I want to talk about today. Whether you're setting up a Twitch to talk about your development or you're doing a Ko-fi subscriber model where you update news posts and people come check it out, or Patreon, or whatever works for you, something is better than nothing, because your advanced audience, the people who show up before you actually make it to market, are going to be those people who are willing to support you and fork out cash right now. Think of it as sort of your Duke Nukem Forever pre-orders, right? People are excited. They will wait up to 5 to 8 years in some cases for indie games they thought were really cool and novel enough to stand out in the market, or at the very least cater their niche tastes. I'm not saying you have to be the next Death Stranding or something like that, or Super Meat Boy or whatever. In fact, I think we should erase that thought from our mind. But I think there's plenty of unique niches to occupy that aren't going to be superstars, so to speak, but they're going to be pretty good, and they're going to be beloved by their audiences. And I think that's why it's important to start talking about the infrastructure that we can set up for ourselves, not just on our individual projects, but to also a greater extent, where are the large, more successful indies helping out their younger siblings? Because a healthy indie community is not about having too much competition or hypersaturation or whatever you want to call it. It's very specifically about cultivating a knowledge and labor base where everyone can share information and oftentimes collaborate on future projects together. We need to start thinking of ourselves a little bit more like bands and musicians, where we're not in direct competition with each other, and we're more so trying to build off of each other as sort of a dialogue, like we're all in one big collective jam session. And I've kind of made this point before, right? We need the infrastructure in place to be able to cultivate and help indies stand out. And what better way to do that than those who have broken out over the fence to kind of come back and help tear the fence down? And there's plenty of groups that have done that. Super Hot Presents comes to mind, as well as what Xavier Nelson is doing right now. And that's the thing, small funding is better than no funding, right? Because oftentimes one of the challenges of even getting investors or publishers interested, no funding, right? I swear to, oftentimes the thing is that even small funding is better than no funding, right? I'd rather have 5 to 20K up front that I can convince publishers and investors to help me go the rest of the way to polish my game than to be in a position where I have no money at all and I can't convince anyone to give me any sort of sum. And that's where a lot of successful indies could come in and help fill the gap, sort of like being angel investors themselves. But we need to think about it differently. We have game cooperatives now. We have small federations of studios. We have publishers that are sort of like almost unpublishers. They're more so just collectives of different auteurs and artists and studios coming together and sort of having a label together as if you would in Bandcamp. And that, to me, is the only sustainable route out of any of this mess. Because the more and more we continue to rely on publishers or raw funds, game developers don't know what to do with that stuff. And they can't afford someone to come in and help tell them what to do. And that's scary, right? Most of us are not used to dealing in quantities of money of $200, $500, $1 million. And I mean, hundreds of thousands of dollars in the first scenario. That's a lot of money to spend, but it burns through really fast if you don't know what you're doing. So we need outreach, we need education, we need to teach people how to be understanding of the ways that businesses work, especially when it comes to creative industries like indie games or even independent film. And independent film kind of has a lot of organizations to help them work through this. There's public funds all over, either in states or small countries if you live in Europe or any other part of the world. There's plenty of opportunities and avenues to get jump started as a filmmaker. But when it comes to being a game maker, question marks? I don't know, Canadian Media Fund, if you're Canadian? And that's the thing, even a lot of public sector funds aren't exactly awesome either. So it sort of leaves us in this strange cavernous gap in between. And it's worth ruminating on what we're going to do about that. Is John Riccitiello being really crappy here? Yeah, but there is an important fact buried down in that, which is the money is drying up and running out, and it doesn't have to.